The laughter was still in his throat when she sat down at the piano. James Ashford had not laughed in 14 months. Not once. Not at his son's birthday. Not at the firm Christmas dinner. Not at a single moment in all the long gray stretch of days since Eleanor had died and taken whatever was light in him along with her. So when he laughed that evening in the drawing room, with 12 dinner guests watching, and his sister-in-law Cordelia standing at his shoulder like a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment, the sound surprised even him. It came out wrong. Too sharp. Too short. The kind of laugh that isn't really pleasure at all, but its cold cousin. And it was aimed at Dorothy Marsh, Dorothy, who had been his housekeeper for 3 years. Dorothy, who was 51 years old and had never once in 3 years asked for anything she wasn't owed. Dorothy, who was standing in the doorway of the drawing room, holding a silver tray with her back straight and her eyes level, having just said, very quietly, in answer to Cordelia's publicly posed question, that yes, she had studied piano, formally, for 11 years. The table had gone still in that particular way tables go still when something has been said that everyone knows will require a reaction. Cordelia had smiled first. Dorothy, she let the name sit there like an object set down on a surface. Surely you're not suggesting, I wasn't suggesting anything, Mrs. Whitmore. Dorothy's voice was the same temperature it always was. You asked whether anyone in the household played. I answered honestly. That was when James laughed. He had not meant it as cruelty. He would tell himself that later, in the car, in the dark, with his hands shaking so badly the key wouldn't find the ignition. He would tell himself he had simply been surprised, that the gap between what Dorothy was, what she did, the uniform and the tray and the hallway outside his study where she waited each morning for instructions, and the image of her at his wife's Steinway was simply too wide to bridge without some involuntary noise escaping him. He would tell himself this, and he would not entirely believe it. Perhaps Dorothy would like to demonstrate, Cordelia said. She turned to the table and opened her hands as if offering a gift. We could use the entertainment. The word entertainment landed in the room and stayed there. Dorothy did not move for 3 seconds. She set the tray down on the sideboard. She smoothed the front of her uniform once, the way she always did, with both palms flat, unhurried, as if the gesture belonged to her alone and no audience could take it. Then she walked to the piano. She had not looked at James once. James Ashford was the kind of man who had built things, not inherited them, not married into them, built them. From a single logistics firm his father left him at 26 into a company with offices in 4 countries and a balance sheet that had not shown red in a decade. He was 63 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the specific confidence of a man who had been right so many times in a row that being wrong had begun to feel like something that happened to other people. His fatal flaw was not arrogance exactly. It was the narrower, quieter thing that comes after enough years of being right. He had stopped imagining that he could be surprised. The house reflected him, or had, before Eleanor. 4 floors of pale Georgian stone on the north edge of the city, the kind of building that communicated serious old money to anyone who saw it, though the money was not old at all, which James knew, and which occasionally still pleased him in a small, quiet way. The entrance hall had black and white marble floors that clicked under good shoes. The study on the 2nd floor had bookshelves that held real books, red ones, their spines cracked and their pages marked, because he had never been the kind of man who filled shelves for appearance alone. The ballroom on the east wing, before it was closed, had been the only room in the house where James felt he was a guest in his own home. Eleanor's room, her instrument, her music, her particular genius for making a room feel like a country you wanted to stay in. When she died, he had closed the ballroom. He had put a cloth over the Steinway. He had told Mrs. Hale, his head housekeeper, that the room was not to be opened. He had not explained why. He had not needed to. The firm ran. The children were managed. Cordelia visited once a fortnight with opinions about the children's school and the household's inefficiencies, and a particular way of looking at the staff that made James feel he ought to apologize on their behalf, though he never did. He had not been unkind to Dorothy. He had been distant in the way he was distant from everyone now, which he told himself was not the same thing. He told himself many things. Cordelia had been the one to raise the question of the missing time. 2 weeks ago, in this same house, in the kitchen, while Mrs. Hale stood by the window with her arms folded and the expression she wore when she knew something was wrong, but had calculated that speaking was not yet her moment, Dorothy had been disappearing from her assigned rooms for 30 to 40 minutes each evening. The east corridor. The far end of the house. She was logged out of the housekeeping system on those evenings. Her assigned rooms were being finished late. Cordelia had presented it as concern. She was very good at presenting things as concern. She had the manner of a woman who had spent her adult life performing worry in rooms where other people had the authority she wanted. And she did it flawlessly. The furrowed brow, the reluctance in the voice, the way she held the log printout as if it pained her to have found it. "It's a pattern," she said. "I've checked the logs myself. 3 weeks of the same thing. You're paying for work that isn't being done, James, and no one seems to know where she's going. That worries me. And you're home. With the children." He had looked at Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Hale had looked at the window. "I'll speak to her," he said. He hadn't. He didn't know why. Something had stopped him. Some instinct he couldn't name. Some small reluctance to begin a conversation that would require him to look at Dorothy directly, which he had been avoiding without entirely realizing it. There was something in her steadiness that unsettled him. The way she moved through his house without flinching. The way she never appeared to want anything from it, except the work. The way Oliver sometimes stood in the kitchen doorway and waited until she noticed him, and then said whatever he had to say as if he had been saving it specifically for her. The way James had come home late one Tuesday evening and found Sophie asleep on the kitchen bench with her head on Dorothy's folded apron, and Dorothy finishing the dishes at the sink without waking her. He had not said anything about it. He had gone upstairs. And then the dinner party. And then Cordelia's question about who in the household played music, asked with the lightness of someone who had prepared the question in advance, who knew exactly what the answer would be and what could be made of it. And then the laughter that had come out of James Ashford like something he'd been holding wrong. Dorothy sat down at the piano bench without adjusting it. She set her hands in her lap for a moment, still, as if she was listening for something that hadn't started yet. Then, she placed her fingers on the keys. She played the opening bars of the nocturne in E-flat. James stopped breathing. It was not that she was competent. It was not that she was better than expected. It was that she played the way Eleanor had played. Not the notes exactly, not the tempo, not any technical thing he could name, but with the same quality of presence, as if the music was not a performance, but a conversation between her and the instrument, and no one else in the room was required to understand it, as if 12 dinner guests and a laughing man and a sister-in-law with a smile like a letter opener were simply weather. Simply something happening outside while the real thing happened in here. The room was entirely silent. Cordelia's smile had not moved. But something behind it had shifted. Dorothy played for 4 minutes. When she finished, she lifted her hands from the keys the way you lift your hands when something is complete, set them in her lap again, and stood. She walked back to the sideboard. She picked up the tray. "I'll bring the dessert course now, Mr. Ashford," she said. "Unless you'd like me to wait." She did not look at him. He said nothing. In the hallway afterward, while the guests were putting on their coats and Cordelia was telling someone a story about a pianist she had once seen at Carnegie Hall, James found Mrs. Hale by the entrance and asked her quietly how long. Mrs. Hale looked at him for a moment. "How long has she been playing the piano, sir? Or how long has she been using the ballroom in the evenings?" He felt the floor shift slightly beneath him. "Both, Mrs." Hale folded her hands together the way she did when she was composing something carefully. "Dorothy studied at the Royal Conservatoire, sir, before her husband died. She came to us afterward, and she's been going to the ballroom most evenings for, I would say, 8 weeks now." She paused. The children asked her to. He looked up. Oliver and Sophie asked her. They found the room unlocked one evening. There was an incident. Sophie was upset. Nighttime. She'd heard music in a dream, she told me afterward. Dorothy heard her in the hallway and brought her downstairs, and I don't know exactly what happened. I know that after that, they started going together, the 3 of them. Mrs. Hale looked at the window. "I should have told you, sir. I made a decision not to, and I'm not certain it was the right one." He didn't answer. He put on his coat. He told her he would be back by 10. He left through the side entrance, and he sat in his car in the dark for 11 minutes without starting the engine, and he thought about his daughter in a dream hearing music and waking to silence, and he thought about 8 weeks of evenings in a closed ballroom. And he thought about what he had sounded like when he laughed. He started the car. He did not go home. He told himself he was going to drive. That was all, that he needed air and movement, and the particular absence of demands that comes from sitting inside a moving car at night when no one knows where you are. He drove down the main avenue, past the iron gates, past the neighbors' pale facades and their lit windows, and their ordinary evenings happening in yellow rectangles behind glass. He drove past his own firm's building, 12 stories of glass and steel that he had watched go up beam by beam 15 years ago, that had his name on the lobby directory, that contained his life's work in filing cabinets and server rooms and the memory of 1,000 decisions, and he felt, for just a moment, as if he were a stranger driving past a building that had nothing to do with him. He drove around the block twice. Then he drove to the west side of the property and parked on the service road, where the old garden wall had a section the groundskeeper had been meaning to repair since March. He got out. He walked along the wall in the dark in his dinner jacket, in shoes that belonged on marble floors and not on wet garden paths. The ground gave slightly under his feet. Branches he hadn't known were there caught his sleeve. He had not been in this part of the garden since the summer Eleanor was alive, when they had walked here in the evenings, because she said the west garden smelled different after dark. It did. It smelled of something old and green and damp, something that made no promises and required nothing, and he had always found it easier to think out here than anywhere inside the house, where every room still held the shape of a person who was no longer in it. He found the gap in the wall. He stood at it and looked through. The ballroom windows were lit. Not the overhead chandeliers, the table lamp in the corner, the one Eleanor had used for late evenings when she didn't want the full light. It cast the room amber. Through the old glass, slightly warped, the piano was a dark shape in the center of the light, and at it sat Dorothy Marsh, and beside her on the bench, pressed against her side like a small boat against a dock, sat Sophie, 8 years old, his daughter. Oliver was on the floor near the window with a book open across his knees, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching his sister. Dorothy was not playing yet. She was showing Sophie something, a hand position, the curve of the fingers, the way the wrist should float. She moved Sophie's hand gently with her own, and Sophie watched with the serious expression she wore when she was trying to learn something she decided mattered to her. Dorothy said something. Sophie tried. A small, imperfect cluster of notes came through the glass. Dorothy said something else. Sophie tried again. This time, it was the opening of the same nocturne. James put his hand on the wall. He watched. He did not move. The cold came up through the garden path, and he didn't feel it. He watched his daughter's hands find notes his wife had played 100 times in this same room, while a woman he had laughed at guided those hands with a patience so complete it made the evening air feel different. Then Sophie said something that he couldn't hear clearly through the glass. She turned to Dorothy and asked a question. And Dorothy answered, and Sophie looked down at the keys again. And then she asked something else, and this time her voice was a little louder and James heard it. She plays the songs Mama used to play. That's why we don't cry at night anymore. She wasn't talking to Dorothy. She was talking to Oliver, who had looked up from his book. James stepped back from the wall. He did not move further. He simply could not stand entirely straight. He put his back against the cold stone and stood there in the dark garden in his dinner jacket. And something happened in his chest that had not happened since the hospital. Something that broke open rather than closed, that went wide rather than narrow. And the sound that came out of him in the dark garden was not the wrong kind it had been earlier in the drawing room. It was a different sound entirely. It had no performance in it at all. He stood there for a long time. When he finally walked back to his car, he sat inside it for several minutes with his hands in his lap because they would not stop shaking. Not from cold. He knew the difference. He sat in the dark and let the shaking happen, and he thought about all the things he had been wrong about, and there were more of them than he had room for right now, and he would need to begin with the one that was most urgent. He had laughed at her. In front of 12 people who worked for him or socialized in his world, he had laughed at Dorothy Marsh. He had not considered what she had come from, or what she had lost, or what she carried through his house each day in silence. He had seen the uniform and the tray and had not looked further. He had let Cordelia set the terms of every conversation about the staff for over a year, and he had never once asked himself what Cordelia's terms served. He drove home. In the morning he asked to see the household logs. He sat at his desk for 2 hours and went through them carefully, not looking for Dorothy's gaps, because those no longer required investigation. He was looking for something else. He was looking at what had been logged, what had been flagged, who had flagged it. The pattern was not hard to find once he knew what he was looking for. Every report about Dorothy's missing time had come through Cordelia, not through Mrs. Hale, who had been head of household for 16 years and had never raised a formal complaint about a staff member without speaking to James first. Through Cordelia, who had submitted them directly to the household management system he rarely reviewed, which fed a record that would, if he had acted on it, have constituted grounds for dismissal. He sat back. He picked up the phone and called his family lawyer. Then he called Mrs. Hale. Then he looked at his calendar and found the thing he was looking for. Cordelia was hosting a dinner at his house in 4 days. She had organized it herself. It was what she had done since Eleanor died, inserted herself into the running of the house with a confidence that James, in his grief, had simply not had the energy to resist. 12 people again, some of them the same guests from the evening Dorothy had played. She had sent him the menu, the guest list, the seating arrangement. He had approved it without reading it. He let it stand. He let the 4 days pass. He did not speak to Dorothy beyond the ordinary exchanges of the household. He watched. In those 4 days, the things he hadn't allowed himself to watch before. The way she moved through rooms, efficient and quiet. The way Oliver stopped her once in the hallway to tell her something from school, and she listened with her full attention until he was finished. The way Sophie set an extra place at the kitchen table for breakfast on Saturday morning and looked up at Dorothy when she came in as if checking that she'd noticed. Dorothy had noticed. On the evening of the dinner, he arrived home early and asked Mrs. Hale to bring Dorothy to his study. Dorothy came in and stood where she always stood, 2 feet inside the door, hands folded, back straight. She looked at him with the level expression he had mistaken for blankness and now understood was something else entirely. He said, "I went to the garden. 4 nights ago. I stood at the wall and I watched through the window." She did not flinch. She did not look away. She said, "I see. I heard what Sophie said." A pause. "Then, she didn't know you were there?" "No." He looked at his desk. "I should have told you that I should have spoken to you before this. I should have spoken to you before the dinner." Before Cordelia had the opportunity to, he stopped. "I owe you an apology. I don't think one will cover it, but I want to begin there." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You had the same look that night that Oliver gets when he hears something he wasn't prepared for. He goes very still, and then he makes a small sound." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't take it personally, Mr. Ashford, the laughter. I've had worse." She paused. "What I do take seriously is the children. If you need the ballroom to stay closed, I need you to tell me directly, and I will honor that. But I want you to know that for 8 weeks, neither of your children has woken in the night." He had nothing to say to that. He didn't try. "I never said I could play for you, Mr. Ashford," Dorothy said. "I played for them. There is a difference." He held that sentence for a long moment. He thought it was the most complete thing anyone had said to him in 14 months. He said, "Stay for the dinner this evening, not to serve it. I'd like you at the table." She looked at him. "That will cause a problem with Mrs. Whitmore, yes," he said. "I'm counting on it." The dinner went as dinners go. Candles, wine, the particular performance of elegance that Cordelia conducted like an orchestra, moving the conversation from table to table with the expertise of a woman who had spent her adult life positioning herself at the center of rooms that didn't belong to her. She had not noticed Dorothy at the far end of the table, or she had chosen not to notice, which amounted to the same tactical decision. It was when the dessert course was cleared that James stood. He thanked the guests for coming. He thanked Mrs. Hale and the kitchen staff by name, each of them, individually, which was not something he had done before, and the specificity of it made several of the guests look up from their glasses. Then he said he had some household business to address, and he was sorry to do it in company, but some things shouldn't wait. He said this without apology in his voice. The voice he used for it was the same one he used in the boardroom when something needed to stop. He placed the household logs on the table. He placed the formal complaint records next to them, each one with its date and its submission timestamp, and the access code that corresponded to a single login in his household management system. He said, quietly and without theater, that over the past 3 months a pattern of false reports had been submitted against a member of his household staff. That the reports had been carefully timed and worded to create grounds for dismissal. That the staff member in question had been doing nothing wrong, had in fact been doing something that James now understood was among the most valuable things that had happened in his house in 14 months. That he had had his lawyer review both the reports and the access records, and the source of every one of those reports was traceable to a single person in this room. He did not raise his voice. He was thinking, as he said it, of Dorothy standing in the drawing room 4 nights ago with her back straight and her eyes level. He was trying to be, in this moment, as much like her as he knew how to be. Cordelia said his name. She said it with the authority of a woman accustomed to having her name carry weight in rooms, and there was a warning in it. The specific warning of someone who has always been able to make a situation about their discomfort rather than the substance at hand. She said, "James, this is not the moment. I think it is exactly the moment," he said. "Since the same people who were here 4 nights ago are here tonight. Since Dorothy Marsh was publicly made to feel small in front of these same guests, I think it's appropriate that the record be corrected in front of them as well." He looked at his sister-in-law. What he saw on her face was not guilt. He had expected guilt and had gotten something narrower, the particular expression of a person who has been caught not doing something wrong, but being something wrong, and who knows the difference between those two things is irreparable. For a moment he almost felt something close to pity for her. Then he thought of Sophie's hands on the piano keys, of the 8 weeks of evenings he had let go uninvestigated, of the thing he had heard himself sound like when he laughed, and the pity passed. Cordelia stood. She looked around the table for a face that would offer her something to stand on. There were no faces. There were people looking at their wine glasses, at the candles, at the tablecloth, at the middle distance. There was Mrs. Hale by the door with her hands folded, and something in her eyes that was not triumph, but was close enough to rest. There was Dorothy, at the far end of the table, looking at no one in particular, her expression the same steady temperature it always was, dignified in the way that requires no audience. Cordelia left. She did not say anything else. There was nothing she could have said that the room would have held for her. The guests left shortly after. Mrs. Hale cleared without being asked. The house went quiet. James found Dorothy in the kitchen, washing a glass that didn't need washing, and he stood in the doorway and said he had a proposal. Not a kindness, he said. Not charity. A real position. He wanted to create an employee welfare role within Ashford Logistics. Someone whose job was to make sure the people who kept his offices and his buildings running had access to health care, to education funding for their children, to someone who actually knew their names. He wanted Dorothy to build it. He had already written the job description. The salary was on the page with the description. She could tell him it was wrong, and he would change it. Dorothy dried the glass. She set it on the shelf. She turned around and looked at him with the expression she had, the level 1, the one he'd finally learned to read. "What would you call it?" she said. "The Eleanor Ashford Employee Foundation." He stopped. "If that's appropriate. I should have asked you whether it was appropriate before I named it." "Eleanor," Dorothy said quietly. She looked at the window over the sink for a moment. She would have done this herself. "She told me once, in this kitchen, she said the house only worked because of the people in it, and she wanted to find a way to honor that. She didn't know how yet." Dorothy looked back at him. "I'll take the role, Mr. Ashford, on the condition that I keep the evenings." "The evenings," he said, "with the children. The piano, unless you'd prefer no," he said, quickly, so she would know he meant it. "No, I want that to continue." She nodded. "Then yes." On the evening of the following Friday, James walked down the east corridor for the first time in 14 months and stood outside the ballroom. The door was ajar. Through it came the sound of the nocturne in E-flat, slowly, imperfectly, with a child's hands finding their way to each note, as if the note was something to be discovered rather than struck. And under it, like something warmer, like the floor of it, Dorothy's voice counting gently, and then stopping counting and just listening. Oliver said something. Sophie laughed. James pushed the door open. The three of them looked up. Sophie immediately moved to make room on the bench. Oliver closed his book and sat up straighter, the way he did when he was trying to appear as though he had not been affected by something. James crossed the room. He sat on the bench beside his daughter. He put his arm around her shoulders. "Show me," he said. Sophie put her hands on the keys and played the opening bars, her face intensely serious. She played 4 bars and then looked up at him. "That's as far as I know," she said. "That's 4 bars further than I can do," he said. She smiled. It was Eleanor's smile. He'd seen it 1,000 times, and somehow tonight it didn't cut the way it had been cutting for 14 months. It was just Sophie, smiling, in the amber light of the room that should have been opened a long time ago. Dorothy said, "Shall we take it from the top?" And Oliver, who had been watching from the floor with his book shut in his lap, said, "Can Dad try?" James looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at him with a steady expression that had more warmth in it now than he could account for, given everything. "You're welcome to try," she said. He put his hands on the keys. On the mantel in the corner of the room, a candle had been sitting unlit for 2 years. Eleanor had put it there herself. In the autumn of the last year she was alive, and no one had moved it. Tonight there was no window open and no draught, and the room was sealed against the cold. When James put his hands on the keys, the candle caught flame. None of them lit it. All 3 of them saw it. No one said anything about it. They didn't need to. There is a story most of us know, whether we have lived it or only felt it somewhere at the edge of a long day. The story of the person in the room who cannot be seen, who does the work no one names, who carries something enormous and private and does not set it down in front of you, because they have learned that the people who could help are often the last to look. This story does not end with the powerful man becoming good, because goodness is not a destination you arrive at. It ends with a door opening, with a child's hands on a piano, with a name on a foundation that will outlast the grief that made it necessary, with someone who was invisible sitting at a table in full light, being looked at finally, not as a function, but as a person who had been there all along, holding something they were never asked to carry, but carried anyway, because the children needed it, and there was no one else. If you have ever been in that room, if you have ever done the work that kept something alive while the people around you looked through you at the walls, then you already know what Dorothy knew. That the playing was never for the one who laughed. That it was never for the audience. That what you do in the quiet hours, for the people who need it, in the rooms no one else bothers to enter, that is the thing that lasts. That is the thing that gets named. And there is no building tall enough, no boardroom impressive enough, no laughter loud enough to make what you do there small.